From the 1920s to the 1970s, China experienced a civil war, Japanese invasion, another deadly civil war, division into two governments, a deadly famine killing more people than World War I, and the rule of a ruthless dictator. That brings us to China in the 1970s. And this is China today, the second biggest economy in the world that keeps growing with millions of opportunities. A China that is a superpower in its truest meaning. Sure, several other countries have seen immense growth in the last few decades, but none have achieved anything close to what China has. The once largely rural country that failed to produce enough to feed its own people has become the world industrial hub, home to brands such as Xiaomi, Tencent, and Alibaba. As late as the 1990s, China had a per capita GDP less than that of North Korea. Today, it boasts the second biggest economy and is predicted to surpass even the USA by the next decade. Many factors contribute to the success, but most of the credit goes to one guy, Deng Xiaoping. He is the reason why China witnessed this economic miracle, and credit must be given to his ideas and his vision. But even under his rule, violence followed. This is the dark history of China's economic rise. China under Mao. In 1927, a civil war broke out in China. The Chinese Communist Party and the ruling nationalist Kuomintang Party continued warring until 1937, when the Japanese attacked. Both sides decided to halt the war so as to fight their new common enemy together. After the end of World War II, when Japan was forced to leave China, the civil war started up again. It ended in October of 1949 when the CCP defeated the Nationalist Party, forcing them to flee to the island of Taiwan. Now, with the Communist Party in control of mainland China, they renamed it the People's Republic of China. Mao Zedong became the first paramount leader. The communist government had to introduce a communist system, so Mao introduced the Great Leap Forward. Many initiatives were made, but the most important one in our discussion is land redistribution. The government took the land from landlords and gave it to the farmers. And gave it to the farmers doesn't mean the government actually gave it to farmers. The land still belonged to the government. The farmers were forced to work like slaves, while the Communist Party had control over resource allocation and food distribution. We won't get into much detail on how this project failed, but with the Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong set a new record that still has yet to be broken, and hopefully never will. His failed allocation and distribution of resources was so poorly executed that it spurred the Great Chinese Famine, killing nearly 45 million people from 1958 to 1962. Some have credited Mao as the biggest mass murderer in human history, a title that surely no one would desire. You might wonder, if this is how bad the Great Leap Forward policy was, then why did no one stop its implementation? Was no one in the most populated country on the planet keen to speak dire warnings about this future? The thing is, Mao was a dictator. No one could stop him once he'd made up his mind. So when people, including members of the Communist Party, started criticizing him for the famine and his other policies, he started the Cultural Revolution. Now, this may sound like a good thing, but it was not. A new student force, the Red Guards, was created, and they would abuse anyone who disagreed with Mao. Not just verbally, but often physically too. Most of the time it was done publicly so that others would know the consequences. Long story short, the ruthless rule of Mao ended in September of 1976 with his death. Deng Xiaoping, who was once tortured brutally under the Cultural Revolution, succeeded Mao and became the next paramount leader of China, and with him came some desperately needed change. Economic reforms under Deng Xiaoping.
如果中国有朝一日变了颜色，变成一个超级大国，也在世界上称王称霸。
Deng gave this speech in 1974. At that time, no one would have imagined that it would one day become a reality and he would be the one making it happen. Born in 1904, Deng was among the first Communist Party leaders. He held senior government positions in the 1950s and 60s, but was sacked during the Cultural Revolution. He was removed, imprisoned, exiled, and then brought back in 1973. In 1976, after Mao's death, Deng became the paramount leader and formed the basis for modern China. Deng introduced a new economic system. In simple words, he brought economic liberalization to the country. In Deng's words, he introduced socialism with Chinese characteristics. So what was this socialism with Chinese characteristics? Hang on, we'll discuss that too. But first, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, take a moment to subscribe and click on the bell icon so you don't miss out on any more of today's economic stories. Anyway, Deng began by destroying the horrific communes originally set up by Mao. Private enterprises were supported instead of collective ones. Overall, most of the new economic system was changed. To understand, let's look into agricultural reforms first. A new system called HRS was introduced. HRS is an acronym for Household Responsibility System. Unlike in the past, households with control over agricultural land were given freedom regarding which crops to grow and how to take care of them. According to HRS, they were accountable for the agreed amount of production. Any surplus belonged to them. They could keep it or sell it in the market for profit. Another project that shaped China's future was the establishment of SEZs, or Special Economic Zones. A Special Economic Zone means you don't have to follow the same rules as the rest of China. Instead, in these areas, the government reduced, sometimes even exempted, taxes and tariffs to promote foreign investments. China already had cheap labor, and with the government's new business-friendly policies, it became a dream place for foreign investors. While most of it had to do with Deng's visionary policies, China somewhat got lucky too. Now, enter the New York Plaza Accord of 1985. We've discussed the accord in detail in our video on the fall of the Japanese economy. If you haven't watched it, check it out next. However, to explain briefly, it made the Japanese export industry very expensive for consumers, so someone with cheaper labor had to fill the gap. There came China and its special economic zones. To give you an idea of how successful the SEZ project was, let's look at this Chinese city. 4 decades ago, it was a rural village, but it has emerged as an international metropolis today. Guess which city we're talking about? The correct answer is Shenzhen. This city, filled with skyscrapers, was once a rural village that served as a path to illegally enter the then British territory of Hong Kong. But when it became the SEZ, its fate changed. In 1980, Shenzhen's GDP was less than 0.3 billion yuan. Today, it has risen to 1.73 trillion yuan, which means an increase of 5,700% in the last 44 years. Net FDI in China rose from $0.06 billion in 1983 to $333 billion in 2021. While we can all learn a few things from China, there are some lessons we shouldn't learn. The rise of China isn't all fairy tale. China also keeps its darkest secrets. Some of them are barely even secrets, like the Tiananmen Square massacre. Tiananmen Square massacre. Spanning over 100 acres, Tiananmen Square in Beijing is one of the world's largest public squares. Its enormous size makes it suitable for large gatherings such as national events and protests. But China doesn't really have protests. Why? Because of what happened in 1989, when Chinese people did protest, demanding political reforms. After a decade of economic liberalization, Chinese thought the country could have some political liberalization too. Like free media, democracy, and respect for human rights. Among those who supported this political liberalization was Hu Yaobang, who was the General Secretary of the CCP from 1980 to 1987, until he was forced to resign for encouraging these Western ideas. Hu died in 1989, and students started demanding political reform. On April 22nd, after his funeral, tens of thousands of students gathered at Tiananmen Square to protest against the one-party system. Protesters were not really against the Communist Party. In fact, many of the protesters were even party members. Even the CCP chief, Zhao Ziyang, called the protest patriotic. But remember the Cultural Revolution of Mao? How did the dictator punish those against him? Deng may have had different economic opinions from Mao, but politically, he was a dictator too. Instead of listening to the students, he brought in the military. They declared martial law in Beijing and stationed troops outside the city. Troops tried to enter the city, but civilians blocked them by flooding the streets. On the night between the 3rd and 4th of June, the military finally entered the city by crushing those who blocked the way. They opened fire on protesters, killing hundreds, if not thousands of them. So, the hero of our story, the architect of modern China, Deng Xiaoping, turns out to be a mass murderer too. This massacre significantly impacted Chinese society. China has not seen any significant protests again, except until recently, but that is a topic for another video. Anyways, Tiananmen Square isn't the only dark reality of China. When it comes to human rights, China just isn't your go-to country. China has been accused of genocide against the Uyghur community in the westernmost province, Xinjiang. Or maybe we shouldn't go with the colonial name and call it East Turkestan. Speaking of colonialism, it's not just the Xinjiang religion, but also Tibet that they took by force. China is also known for persecuting religions. They have made labor camps to imprison and punish Falun Gongs, and concentration camps for Uyghur Muslims, where once you go in, you come out only by renouncing your faith. In China, it's also not easy to relocate from rural to urban areas or from one city to the other. It's because of a household registration system called hukou system, which places significant limitations on domestic migrations, taking away the right to free education and healthcare from migrants. In the last 4 decades, China has shown unreal growth. However, while they did grow economically, the Chinese are still deprived of one fundamental right: freedom. Do you think China can ever have that, or will things continue this way? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you remained with us until the end of the video, leave a Chinese flag emoji in the comments, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to stay tuned.